The testing chamber was massive, easily the size of 3 football fields. Rachel Cooper stood at the starting line of the endurance track, her heart pounding in her chest. Around the observation deck above, representatives from 47 different alien species watched with curious eyes. Some had multiple eyes. Some had stalks. Some glowed faintly in the dim light. Commander Vrel adjusted his monitor, his 4-fingered hands moving quickly across the controls. He was Vieronin, tall and thin with pale blue skin that shimmered under the lights. This was his 20th year conducting entrance trials for the Galactic Council, and he had seen every species handle this test the same way. They ran until their bodies forced them to stop. Simple. Safe. Predictable. Begin when ready, he announced through the speakers. Rachel took a deep breath and started running. The track stretched ahead of her in a perfect oval, the surface soft and forgiving under her sneakers. She found her rhythm quickly, her breathing steady, her arms pumping. Back on Earth, she had been a marathon runner. Not professional but dedicated. She knew how to pace herself. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Vrel noticed his assistant leaning forward, watching the human with unusual interest. She's still going, the younger Vieronin said. They all go for a while, Vrel replied without looking up. She'll stop soon. But Rachel didn't stop. 2 hours became 2.5. Her legs began to burn, that familiar fire spreading through her muscles. Her lungs worked harder, pulling in oxygen. Sweat poured down her face, soaking through her shirt. In the observation deck, whispers spread through the alien observers. A Keleth scientist checked her datapad 3 times, confused by the readings. Her body is sending shutdown signals, she muttered. Why isn't she stopping? Vrel finally looked up from his monitor, his eyes widening. Every other species had biological limits built into their genetics. When the body reached dangerous exhaustion levels, automatic systems kicked in. The legs would simply refuse to move. The consciousness would fade. It was evolution's way of preventing death by overexertion. The human should have stopped 90 minutes ago. Commander, his assistant said nervously, should we end the test? Her vitals are approaching critical levels. Vrel watched Rachel stumble slightly, catch herself, and keep running. Her form was getting sloppy now. Her feet dragged a bit with each step. But she didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. Why doesn't she quit? The assistant asked, genuine worry in his voice. Vrel felt a chill run through his body. He had studied human files before this test, of course. Read about their history, their wars, their achievements. But reading data and watching reality were 2 different things. I don't think she can, he whispered. Then he corrected himself because he understood now what he was seeing. No. I think she won't. 3 hours came and went. Rachel's vision started to blur. Her body was screaming at her in every possible way. Her muscles felt like they were tearing. Her heart hammered against her ribs like it wanted to break free. Every nerve ending begged her to stop, to collapse, to give her body the rest it desperately needed. But somewhere in her mind, in that part of her brain that made her human, she pushed back against all those signals. Just a little more, she told herself. Just keep going. The alien observers were standing now, pressed against the glass of the observation deck. Some looked horrified. Others looked fascinated. A few looked frightened. At 3 hours and 17 minutes, Rachel's legs finally gave out. Not because her genetics forced them to stop, but because they physically couldn't hold her weight anymore. She went down hard, her knees hitting the track, her hands barely catching her before her face did. The medical team teleported into the chamber instantly. They were Sorvok, small and efficient, with medical scanners already humming. They rushed to Rachel's side, expecting to find someone at death's door. Instead, they found her smiling. Did I pass? Rachel gasped between heavy breaths. Her chest heaved. Sweat dripped from her chin onto the track. But she was smiling. Vrel came down from the observation deck, moving faster than he usually did. He stood over Rachel, looking at his datapad, reading the numbers again and again. His hands trembled slightly. In all his years he had never seen anything like this. Your species is broken, he said quietly, not meaning it as an insult but as a statement of fact. Every species in the galaxy had safety measures. Every species knew when to stop. Humans apparently did not. Rachel let out a weak laugh, still trying to catch her breath. The medical team helped her sit up, their scanners showing that despite everything she would be fine. Exhausted, yes. Pushed beyond any reasonable limit, absolutely. But she would recover. Or maybe, Rachel said, looking up at Commander Vrel with tired but determined eyes, we're the only ones who aren't. Vrel looked around at the other alien observers. They were talking among themselves, their various languages filling the air with confused chatter. He knew what they were thinking because he was thinking it too. They had just witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. Something that went against every understanding of biology and evolution they had. They had witnessed a human decide that her will was stronger than her body. And somehow, impossibly, she had been right. Dr. Jake Morrison's hands shook as he filled another syringe. 68 hours. That's how long he'd been awake. His eyes burned, his vision blurred at the edges, and his back screamed from leaning over patient beds for days straight. The medical facility on Threshold 7 mining colony had never been designed for a plague outbreak. It was supposed to handle broken bones, mining accidents, maybe the occasional case of space flu. Not this. The disease had come out of nowhere, spreading through the colony like wildfire through dry grass. First one miner got sick. Then 5. Then 20. Within 48 hours, the alien species working the colony began their evacuation procedures. The VRNN left first, their protocols clear and absolute. The Keleth followed 6 hours later. The Sorvok packed up their equipment and disappeared into their ships before the sun set on day 2. They all had the same excuse. The same cold, logical reasoning. When survival probability drops below 40%, retreat is mandatory. It was written into their genetics, their culture, their laws. Stay and fight when you can win. Leave when you cannot. Jake understood the logic. He really did. But understanding something and accepting it were two very different things. He moved to the next bed where a young woman named Patricia lay unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. She was 24, had been working the mining equipment for 6 months, saving money to send back to her family on Earth. Jake checked her vitals, adjusted her oxygen mask, and made a note on his data pad. Her fever was down 0.5 degree. Small victory, but he'd take it. Dr. Morrison. A voice crackled through the comm system mounted on the wall. Captain Tvara of the VRNN medical ship in orbit. Your government has authorized evacuation. We have a shuttle ready. Leave now. Jake glanced around the medical facility. 23 humans in beds. Some conscious, most not. All of them sick. All of them depending on him. He was the only doctor left on this rock. The only one who stayed when everyone else ran. Can't do that, Captain, Jake said, not even looking at the comm unit. There was a long pause. Doctor, I have reviewed your file. You are a skilled physician. Your survival has value. These patients, their probability of recovery is less than 30%, even with treatment. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Jake muttered, pulling up another patient's chart on his datapad. You will die, Tvara said, and there was something in his voice that might have been concern. Or maybe just confusion. Jake couldn't tell anymore. He stopped walking, standing in the middle of the medical bay surrounded by the sound of breathing machines and heart monitors. His own heart felt like it was beating too fast and too slow at the same time. Exhaustion did weird things to perception. Maybe, Jake admitted, his voice quiet. But they won't. Not if I can help it. He moved to patient 47, an older man named Dennis who'd been on Threshold 7 for 15 years. Dennis had grandkids back on Earth. Jake had seen the pictures. 5 little faces smiling from Dennis's locker in the mining quarters. Jake adjusted the 4-drip, checked the medication levels, and wiped sweat from Dennis's forehead with a cool cloth. Up in orbit, Captain Tvara watched through the cameras mounted throughout the colony. He watched the human stumble, saw him catch himself on a medical cart before he fell. Tvara had been monitoring Dr. Morrison for 3 days now. The human hadn't slept. Hadn't stopped working. Every 4 hours he injected himself with stimulants just to stay conscious. Every 6 hours he took vitamin supplements and forced down a protein bar. This is irrational, Tvara muttered to himself in the quiet of his command center. His second officer looked over. Sir? The human. He's going to die trying to save patients who are statistically unsavable. It makes no sense. The second officer studied the monitor. Humans rarely make sense, Captain. Days blurred together for Jake. 1 week became 2. 2 became 3. He learned to sleep in 20-minute bursts in a chair next to the medication supplies. He learned to spot the early warning signs of the disease's worst symptoms before they fully manifested. He learned which medications worked best and which combinations, adapting on the fly because the standard treatments the VRNN had left behind weren't designed for human biology fighting an alien plague. He lost 4 patients in the first week. The grief nearly broke him, but there wasn't time to fall apart. The others needed him. So he kept going. 3 weeks after the outbreak began, Jake walked out of the medical facility into the bright artificial daylight of Threshold 7's dome. 19 survivors walked with him. 19 people who had been given a 12% chance of survival. 19 people who were alive because one exhausted doctor decided that odds didn't matter as much as trying. Captain Tvar's ship landed near the medical facility. He emerged from the shuttle, his tall frame casting a long shadow. He looked at Jake, really looked at him. The human had lost weight. His eyes were hollow. He moved like every step hurt. But he was smiling. Tvar felt something shift in his understanding of the universe. He had spent his entire life believing that logic dictated survival. Calculate the odds, make the smart choice, live to fight another day. But watching Jake Morrison lean against a wall, exhausted beyond measure yet somehow victorious, Tvar understood something terrifying. Humans didn't calculate odds. They simply refused to lose. War Chief Drek of the Korthax Empire had conquered 17 colonies in his military career. Some surrendered immediately when they saw his fleet. Others fought for a few days, maybe a week if they were particularly stubborn. But they all eventually came to the same logical conclusion. When you're outgunned, outmanned, and surrounded, you surrender. It's basic military sense. Outpost Kara should have been the easiest conquest of all. Drek had done the calculations himself. 600 humans living in a small mining colony on the edge of Council space. His fleet had 20 warships, each carrying enough firepower to level a city. The math was so simple a child could understand it. The humans would see his fleet, recognize the impossible odds, and surrender within 30 days. Maybe less. That was 5 months ago. Drek stood in his command center aboard his flagship, staring at the holographic display of Outpost Kara below. The colony's shields flickered weakly, holding on by some miracle of human engineering. His military advisors stood around him, their faces showing the same confusion he felt. Status report, Drek growled. The eastern shield generator is at 15% power, War Chief. The northern defenses are practically non-existent. Their food supplies should have run out 6 weeks ago according to our intelligence. His second-in-command paused. Yet they continued to resist. Drek's jaw tightened. This made no sense. Every species in the galaxy understood basic survival math. When your probability of victory drops below 20%, you negotiate. When it drops below 10%, you surrender. It wasn't cowardice. It was intelligence. Living to fight another day. The humans of Outpost Kara apparently didn't understand this concept. Down on the colony's surface, Amy Walker moved through the central command hub like a ghost. She'd lost 20 pounds since the siege began. Her uniform hung loose on her frame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. But her hands were steady as she studied the defense grid on her screen. "They're launching another assault on the eastern wall," David Brooks said, rushing up to her station. He was her second-in-command, a former mining engineer who'd learned military tactics through necessity over the past 5 months. Same pattern as yesterday. 3 dropships, about 60 soldiers. Amy pulled up the eastern section on her display. The wall there was battered, held together more by hope and welding patches than actual structural integrity. "How many defenders do we have there?" David checked his datapad and his face went pale. 12. 3 of them are wounded from yesterday's attack. "They'll hold," Amy said simply, already moving to coordinate support fire from their remaining artillery. David stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Amy, that's impossible. 12 people can't hold against 60 Korthax warriors. The math doesn't work." Amy looked up at him, and despite the exhaustion, despite the hunger, despite everything they'd endured, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was something harder, something that had been forged in 5 months of refusing to quit. "Tell them that." She opened the comm channel to the eastern wall. "Martinez, this is Walker. You've got incoming. 3 dropships." "Copy that, Commander," came the reply. Martinez sounded tired but steady. "We'll handle it." "I know you will." Walker out. The eastern wall held. It held because 12 humans, running on 400 calories a day in sheer stubbornness, decided it would. They used every trick they'd learned. Collapsed a section of the wall to create a bottleneck. Used mining explosives in ways the manufacturers never intended. Fought with a desperation that the Korthax, who always calculated acceptable losses, simply couldn't match. Up in orbit, Drek watched the battle feed. He watched 12 humans hold against 60 of his best warriors. Watched them win through tactics that bordered on insanity. One human actually climbed on top of a Korthax soldier and rode him like some kind of animal while stabbing at weak points in his armor. "This is madness," one of his advisors whispered. Drek said nothing. He'd been saying that for 5 months. It didn't change anything. The humans had been living on starvation rations for weeks. 400 calories per person per day. Drek's nutritionist had told him that most species would be too weak to fight after 2 weeks on such rations. Most would be dead after 4. The humans kept fighting. Their shields were failing. Their ammunition was nearly gone. They'd been converting mining equipment into weapons, using our processors as makeshift forges. Every day Drek expected to wake up and find a surrender signal. Every day he was disappointed. War Chief, his communications officer said hesitantly. The Council is demanding an explanation. They want to know why a simple colony conquest has taken 5 months. Drek's hands clenched into fists. How did he explain this? How did he tell the Council that he'd been outmaneuvered by 600 starving humans who should have surrendered months ago? That every tactical advantage he had seemed meaningless against an enemy that simply refused to acknowledge they were beaten? For the first time in his long military career, War Chief Drek felt something he'd never experienced before. Something that chilled him more than any weapon ever could. Doubt. He looked down at Outpost Kara, at the flickering shields and battered walls. At the colony that should have fallen in 30 days but had somehow held for 5 months. And he wondered, for the first time, if he was fighting an enemy he couldn't actually defeat. Because how do you beat someone who doesn't know when to quit? The Galactic Medical Assembly Hall could hold 3,000 beings. Today every seat was filled. Scientists, doctors, and researchers from 47 different species had gathered to hear something that would change everything they understood about biology and evolution. Dr. Ven stood at the center of the circular stage, her small Kelith frame barely reaching the podium. She had green-tinted skin that shifted slightly under the bright lights, and her 6 eyes blinked in sequence as she looked around the room. In her 40 years as a neuroscientist, she had never felt this nervous. I know many of you have read my preliminary reports, she began, her voice amplified through the hall speakers. But I wanted to present my complete findings in person, because what I've discovered about humans changes everything we thought we knew about intelligent life. She pressed a button on her control pad. Behind her, a massive holographic display lit up, showing a strand of DNA rotating slowly in 3 dimensions. This, she said, pointing to a specific section that glowed bright blue, is the preservation limit gene. Every species in this room has it. Every species in the Galactic Council has it. It's been found in every intelligent life form we've ever studied. The assembly murmured in agreement. This was basic biology taught to children across the galaxy. Every species except one, Dr. Ven continued. The holographic display switched to show human DNA. Where the blue glow should have been, there was nothing. Just empty genetic code. Humans lack the preservation limit gene entirely. The murmuring grew louder. A Sorvok scientist in the 3rd row stood up. That's impossible. Without the PLG, a species would work itself to death. They'd push their bodies until catastrophic failure. Yes, Dr. Ven said simply. They would. And they do. She pulled up another hologram, this one showing a human brain in stunning detail. Neural pathways lit up in different colors, firing in patterns that looked almost like fireworks. The preservation limit gene serves a critical function. When our bodies reach dangerous levels of exhaustion, pain, or stress, it triggers an automatic shutdown. We collapse. We lose consciousness. Our muscles simply stop responding to neural commands. It's evolution's mercy. It keeps us alive by forcing us to stop before we kill ourselves. Dr. Ven zoomed in on a specific section of the human brain. Humans have all the warning systems. They feel pain more acutely than most species. Their bodies send distress signals constantly. When a human is exhausted, their nervous system screams at them to stop. But watch what happens next. The hologram showed neural activity in real time, recorded from Rachel Cooper during her 3-hour endurance test. The assembly watched as warning signals flooded the human brain, red alerts firing across multiple systems. Any other species would have shut down automatically. Instead, a different part of the brain lit up. Blue pathways overrode the red warnings. The human kept going. Humans possess what they call willpower, Dr. Ven explained. It's a conscious override mechanism. They can feel every warning signal, acknowledge the danger, and then simply choose to ignore it. They can consciously push their bodies beyond biological limits. That's a defect, someone shouted from the back of the hall. That's evolutionary suicide. A species like that should have gone extinct. The room erupted in agreement. Voices overlapped in dozens of languages, all saying essentially the same thing. This was wrong. This was broken. This was dangerous. Dr. Ven waited for the noise to die down. When it finally did, she asked a simple question. Is it? She changed the holographic display to show footage from Threshold 7. The assembly watched Dr. Jake Morrison stumble through the medical facility, clearly exhausted beyond any reasonable limit, yet still working. Still saving lives. Humans at Threshold 7 saved 19 lives because one doctor could work beyond exhaustion, Dr. Venn said quietly. Every other species evacuated when survival probability dropped below 40%. The humans stayed at 12% probability and won. The footage changed to show Outpost Kara. The assembly watched 12 human defenders hold an eastern wall against 60 Korthax warriors. Watched them fight on 400 calories a day. Watched them survive a 5-month siege that should have killed them in 6 weeks. Outpost Kara survived because 600 humans refused to accept defeat. What we call a defect, what we call evolutionary suicide, they call determination. Dr. Venn let the silence stretch. She could see scientists whispering to each other, their faces showing confusion, fear, fascination. A VRNN doctor in the front row had gone completely pale. We've spent millennia breeding safety into our species, Dr. Venn continued, her voice steady. We've optimized for survival, for logical decision-making, for knowing when to quit. We've made ourselves perfectly rational beings who calculate odds and make smart choices. She gestured to the human brain still rotating on the holographic display. Humans never did that. They kept the ability to be irrational. To push beyond limits. To ignore the math and fight anyway. Dr. Venn looked around the assembly hall, meeting eyes with as many beings as she could. So now we must ask ourselves a difficult question. We've always assumed that our way was the right way. That safety and logic and preservation instincts made us superior. But after studying humans, after seeing what they can achieve by refusing to quit, I have to wonder. She paused, letting her final words carry weight. Who is actually more evolved? They came from deep space, a nightmare that had no name until they arrived. The Galactic Council called them the Devourer Swarms, though that name didn't capture the true horror of what they were. Billions of insect-like ships moving as one organism, consuming everything in their path. Planets, stations, entire star systems swallowed and converted into more ships, more soldiers, more hunger. The swarms hit Council space like a hammer through glass. Admiral Kate Foster stood on the bridge of the UHSN Relentless, watching the tactical display light up with red hostile markers. There were so many that they blurred together into solid masses. Her bridge crew worked quietly around her, their faces calm despite the chaos displayed on the screens. Admiral, the VRNN fleet is calculating retreat parameters, her communications officer reported. They're projecting 35% casualties if they engage. Kate nodded. She'd read the VRNN military doctrine. It was logical, careful, designed to preserve forces. When projected casualties hit 35%, you fall back. Regroup. Fight another day. Keleth fleet is doing the same, the officer continued. Their threshold is 40%. Sorvak are at 30. Every alien fleet in the battle group was running the numbers, calculating odds, determining at what point retreat became mandatory. It was how civilized species fought wars. With mathematics and logic and cold reason. What's our threshold, Admiral? Her executive officer asked. Commander Ryan Hayes had served with Kate for 6 years. He already knew the answer. Kate smiled, and it was not a kind smile. We don't have one. The bridge crew didn't react. They'd known this moment was coming from the moment they joined the human fleet. There were no calculated retreat points in human military doctrine. No magic percentage where survival became more important than victory. All ships, Kate said into the fleet-wide channel. Advance. Target the center of their formation. The human fleet moved forward while every other species' ships began falling back to defensive positions. 30 human warships charging directly into the heart of a swarm that numbered in the thousands. Every tactical computer in the Council fleet screamed warnings. Probability of mission success, 4%. Projected casualties, 86%. Recommended action, immediate withdrawal. The humans ignored every warning and accelerated. Captain Brian Cole commanded the destroyer Freedom's Price on the fleet's right flank. His ship shuddered as Devourer weapons tore into the shields. Alarms wailed across the bridge. His tactical officer shouted damage reports, but Brian's hands stayed steady on the controls. Hull breach on decks 3 and 4, someone yelled. Shields at 30%. Keep firing, Brian ordered calmly. And get me closer to that capital ship. His crew stared at him for half a second, then went back to work. Because that's what humans did. When the logical choice was retreat, they pushed forward instead. The Freedom's Price died 40 minutes into the battle, but not before Brian rammed it into a Devourer command vessel, taking both ships down in a ball of fire that briefly outshone the nearby star. Commander Jennifer Hayes flew her fighter wing through impossible spaces, weaving between Devourer ships that should have torn her squadron apart. She'd been in her cockpit for 17 hours straight. No sleep. No breaks. Just pure adrenaline and the kind of coffee that could probably be used as reactor fuel. "Commander, you need to return to base," her wing leader said over the comm. "You're running on fumes." "Noted," Jennifer replied, then pushed her fighter into a dive that made her vision gray at the edges. "But I'm not done yet." She held her position for 17 hours because that's how long it took. Because someone needed to protect the capital ships. Because quitting wasn't in her vocabulary. Lieutenant Chris Walker's frigate lost its main engine 40 minutes into the fight. Life support started failing 20 minutes after that. Every system on his ship screamed that he needed to evacuate. Instead, Chris manually piloted his dying ship toward the largest Devourer vessel he could find. His crew had already abandoned ship. He was alone on the bridge, breathing recycled air that was more carbon dioxide than oxygen, flying on backup thrusters that were never meant for combat maneuvering. He survived the collision. Barely. The rescue team found him unconscious in the wreckage 3 hours later, half dead but somehow still breathing. The Devourer swarms had evolved over millions of years to fight rational opponents. Their tactics were built on one simple truth: every species had a breaking point. Every species calculated odds. Every species knew when to retreat. They had never faced an enemy that simply refused to stop. 3 months into the war, something impossible happened. The Devourers began to retreat. Not because they were losing exactly. They still had numerical superiority. They still had the resources to win. But humans kept coming. No matter how many ships were destroyed, no matter how impossible the odds became, humans kept fighting with a ferocity that made no logical sense. The swarms didn't understand it. Couldn't process it. Their entire strategic framework was built on the assumption that enemies would behave rationally. Humans weren't rational. They were determined. 6 months after the first battle, the Galactic Council held an emergency session. Every military strategist in Council space gathered to analyze what had happened. How had humanity, the newest and smallest military force in the Council, turned the tide against an enemy that should have destroyed them? They updated their military doctrine that day. Next to every strategic calculation, every probability analysis, every tactical assessment, they added a new variable: human persistence factor. They tried to quantify it. Tried to turn it into numbers and percentages. But how do you measure the refusal to quit? How do you calculate stubbornness? How do you put a number on the human ability to look at impossible odds and say not today? You can't. Some things can't be measured. They can only be witnessed.